The moment I saw Richard Sterling dragged out of his luxury mansion in handcuffs, his face pale as death, his eyes desperately searching for an escape that didn't exist, I knew it was finally over. 25 years. That's what Jason got. My husband, the man I'd loved and trusted for 8 years, sentenced to spend a quarter of a century behind bars for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. Natalie, my supposed best friend since college, got 15 years. Judge Maxwell, the corrupt judge who helped steal everything from me, 20 years. Marcus Thorne, the boss who humiliated me in front of everyone, 10 years. And Richard Sterling, the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, who orchestrated my mother's murder life without parole. As I stood there watching them being led away one by one, I felt something I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Peace. Real peace. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you want to know how a woman who lost everything, who was betrayed by everyone she trusted, who was left with nothing but anger and despair, managed to bring down an entire pharmaceutical empire and send every single person who wronged her to prison, then stay with me. Hit that like button, subscribe to hear more stories like this, and drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. Because this story, my story, starts much earlier in a place of darkness I never thought I'd escape. Let me take you back to where it all began. 3 years ago, I was Evelyn Rhodes, a 32-year-old marketing specialist at a mid-sized pharmaceutical consulting firm in Seattle. I had what everyone would call a good life. A beautiful home in Queen Anne, a husband who seemed perfect on paper, a best friend I'd known since our freshman year at the University of Washington, and a job that paid well enough to afford the lifestyle we'd built together. Jason Vance. My husband worked as a regional sales director at what I thought was a medical equipment company. He was charming, attentive when he needed to be, and had a smile that could light up a room. We'd been married for 5 years at that point, together for 8. Natalie Thorne had been my closest friend for even longer, nearly 15 years. We'd met during orientation week at college, bonded over our shared love of bad coffee and good books, and stayed inseparable ever since. She was the maid of honor at my wedding. She was the person I called when I needed to vent about work stress or celebrate small victories. She knew everything about me, all my vulnerabilities, all my dreams, all my fears. That's what I thought anyway. What I didn't know was that she'd been documenting every single one of those vulnerabilities, reporting them back to people who wanted to use them against me. My mother, Catherine Rhodes, had died 3 years before all of this started. At least that's what I'd been told. She died in a car accident on a rainy October night, her vehicle sliding off the road and crashing into a tree on a winding stretch of highway outside Portland. The police report said her blood alcohol level was slightly elevated, that she'd lost control on a slick curve. I'd grieved her death, blamed myself for not visiting more often, for being too caught up in my own life to notice if she'd been struggling. She'd been a research scientist at a pharmaceutical company, brilliant and meticulous, the kind of woman who triple-checked everything. The idea of her drinking and driving never sat right with me, but grief has a way of making you accept things you shouldn't. After her death, I'd thrown myself into my marriage and my work, trying to fill the void she'd left behind. Jason had been supportive in those early months, holding me when I cried, telling me it would get better with time. Natalie had been there too, showing up with wine and takeout, letting me talk about my mother for hours without complaint. I thought I was lucky to have them. I had no idea I was surrounded by predators. The day everything changed started like any other Wednesday. I woke up at 6:30, made coffee, got dressed in one of my conservative work blazers, and drove to the office in downtown Seattle. The morning was typical meetings about campaign strategies for a new diabetes medication. One of our clients was launching emails back and forth with vendors, the usual routine that had become so familiar it was almost mindless. Around 11, I started feeling off. Not sick exactly, just uneasy. A tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. I tried to push through it, but by lunchtime I knew something was wrong. That's when my phone rang. The number was blocked, and normally I wouldn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was female, digitally distorted, mechanical, and eerie. "Mrs. Vance," the voice said, and I felt my blood run cold. "If you want to know the truth about your husband, go to 1247 Dexter Avenue North, Apartment 3B, today, 2 o'clock. Don't call first, just go. Just." The line went dead before I could respond. My hands were shaking as I stared at my phone. I knew that address. It was in Lower Queen Anne, not far from our house. I told my assistant I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. The drive took 12 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing, creating and dismissing explanations. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was trying to scam me. But that voice, that cold, mechanical voice, had known my married name, had known exactly how to deliver the information to make me act on it. I parked across the street from the building, a modern apartment complex with large windows and a trendy coffee shop on the ground floor. I sat in my car for 10 minutes debating whether to go in or drive away and pretend this never happened. But I couldn't. That unease I'd felt all morning had crystallized into something sharper, something that demanded I know the truth, whatever it was. I got out of the car and walked into the building. The lobby was empty, the elevator smooth and quiet as it carried me to the third floor. Apartment 3B was at the end of the hall. I stood outside the door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I raised my hand to knock, then stopped. The voice had said not to call first, to just go. Did that mean I should just walk in? I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open slowly, and that's when I heard it. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but the intimate, self-satisfied laughter of two people who thought they were completely alone and completely safe. Jason's voice. God, I don't know how I kept up the act this long. She's so predictable, Nat. So easy to manipulate. Natalie's voice lighter, more mocking. I told you she would be. She's always been desperate for approval. That's why this worked so perfectly. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still on the doorknob, my breath caught in my throat. They were talking about me. They had to be talking about me. I moved forward, my feet carrying me towards the bedroom at the end of the apartment. The door was partially open. Through the gap, I could see them. Jason shirtless, pulling on his jeans. Natalie wrapped in a sheet, her hair messy, her expression smug and victorious. I didn't think, I just reacted. I kicked the door open hard enough that it slammed against the wall. They both jumped, Jason's hands freezing on his belt buckle. Natalie's eyes going wide before narrowing into something calculating and cold. For a moment, nobody spoke. We just stared at each other, three people whose lives were about to be permanently destroyed. Jason recovered first, his face shifting from shock to irritation. Evelyn, what are you doing home? We need to talk about this like adults. His voice was calm, almost condescending, as if I was the one being unreasonable by walking in on my husband in bed with my best friend. Natalie pulled the sheet tighter around herself, but she didn't look ashamed. She looked triumphant. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. Oh, Evelyn, you finally figured it out. I was wondering when you'd catch on. I thought you were supposed to be smart. Her tone was dripping with mockery, each word designed to cut. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Civilized, I heard myself say, my voice shaking with fury. You're in my bed in what I'm assuming is the apartment I've been paying for, and you want to talk about being civilized. How long has this been going on? Jason sighed as if I was being tedious. Long enough that I can't pretend anymore, sweetheart. You're too predictable, too boring. This, he gestured between himself and Natalie, has been going on for years, since before we got married, actually. The floor seemed to tilt under my feet. Before we got married. That meant every moment of our relationship, every promise, every intimate confession, every plan we'd made together had been a lie. I looked at Natalie, the woman I'd trusted with my deepest secrets, the woman who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral, and I saw a stranger who'd been playing a role for 15 years. Why? I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. Natalie laughed a sharp, brittle sound. Why? Because it was easy, Evelyn. You made it so easy. You trusted everyone, believed everyone. You were the perfect mark. She stood up, letting the sheet fall completely shameless. Did you really think someone like me would be friends with someone like you out of genuine affection? Please. This has always been about what I could get from you. I felt something inside me crack, but instead of breaking down, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. I looked at Jason, at his smug, self-satisfied face, at Natalie with her cruel smile, and I made myself a promise. They thought I was weak. They thought I was predictable. They thought they'd broken me. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice steady now, cold as ice. I was predictable. I trusted you. I believed in you. But you just made the biggest mistake of your lives. This isn't over. Not even close. I turned and walked out of that apartment, leaving them behind. I didn't take anything with me except my purse and my phone. As I drove away, I didn't cry. I couldn't. The shock was too great, too all-consuming. I just drove aimlessly at first, through the streets of Seattle, watching the city blur past my windows. Eventually, I found myself at a cheap motel near the airport, the kind of place that asked for cash and didn't care about your story. I checked in, locked the door behind me, and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. But the nightmare was only beginning. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and dozens of texts. Most were from Jason, ranging from apologetic to angry to threatening. A few were from Natalie, mocking and cruel, and one was from my office. I called back, and my assistant Rebecca answered with an uncomfortable edge to her voice. Evelyn Marcus needs to see you immediately. He says it's urgent. Marcus Thorne was my direct supervisor, a man I'd worked under for 6 years. He'd always been professional, if somewhat distant. I told Rebecca I'd be there within the hour, then showered, changed into the spare clothes I'd grabbed from my car, and drove to the office. I should have known something was wrong when I walked into the conference room and saw not just Marcus but the entire marketing team sitting around the table. 8 people all staring at me with expressions ranging from pity to judgment. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his face arranged in a mask of false sympathy. "Evelyn, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat." He gestured to the only empty chair positioned at the far end of the table like I was on trial. I sat down slowly, my heart starting to race again. "What's this about Marcus?" He sighed heavily as if this was painful for him. "Evelyn, we've been concerned about your performance for some time now. Your productivity has declined significantly over the past year, and we've received complaints from colleagues about your emotional instability." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We think it's best if you take some time away from the company. Indefinitely." The words hit me like a physical blow. Emotional instability. My performance has been excellent. I just closed the Vertex account last month. What are you talking about? Marcus's expression didn't change. The Vertex account succeeded despite your involvement, not because of it. We have documentation of multiple incidents where you've displayed erratic behavior, mood swings, and poor judgment. Given what we understand about your personal life right now, we think you need to focus on getting help rather than working here. The implication was clear. Someone had told them about what happened yesterday. Someone had gotten to them first, had painted me as unstable, as someone whose personal problems were affecting her work. I looked around the table at my colleagues, people I'd worked with for years, and saw no support, no ally, no one willing to defend me. "This is wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Someone is lying to you. I don't know who or why, but this is completely fabricated." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Evelyn, denial is a common response to stress. We're not judging you. We want you to get better, but we can't have you here in your current state. Please pack your belongings. Security will escort you out." The humiliation of that moment is something I still carry with me. Walking back to my desk with a security guard shadowing me, packing my personal items into a cardboard box while my former colleagues watched and whispered. I wanted to scream at them, to demand they listen to me, but I knew it would only confirm whatever narrative they'd been fed. So I packed in silence, my hands shaking, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. As I was leaving, I passed Marcus's office. Through the open door, I saw him on the phone, laughing at something. He glanced up, met my eyes, and I saw it. That flicker of something cold and calculated. This wasn't about my performance. This was planned. Someone had paid him to do this, or threatened him, or both. I filed that information away, another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to see. The next few weeks were a blur of legal nightmares. Jason filed for divorce 3 days after I walked out. His lawyers were vicious, expensive, and well-connected. They painted me as mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, and emotionally abusive. They presented falsified bank statements showing I'd been draining our joint accounts for personal shopping sprees. They brought in Natalie as a character witness, and she performed beautifully, crying on cue as she described how worried she'd been about me, how I'd become paranoid and accusatory, how she'd tried to help, but I'd pushed her away. The judge presiding over our divorce case was Robert Maxwell, a man in his 60s with a reputation for being tough but fair. Except he wasn't fair. Not even close. Every motion my lawyer filed was denied. Every piece of evidence I tried to present was dismissed as irrelevant or inadmissible. Every lie Jason's team told was accepted as gospel truth. I sat in that courtroom day after day watching my life be systematically dismantled by people who smiled and lied and got away with it because they had money and power and connections. My lawyer, Gerald Black, was young and earnest but completely outmatched. After one particularly brutal session where Judge Maxwell had berated him for wasting the court's time, Gerald pulled me aside. "Evelyn, I'm sorry, but I think we need to consider accepting their settlement offer. If we keep fighting this, you're going to end up with nothing." "Their offer is nothing, Gerald. They want me to walk away from my house, my savings, everything with just $10,000 and a gag order." He looked uncomfortable. "It's better than what you'll get if Maxwell rules against you completely. And I think he will. I don't know what's going on, but this case isn't being tried fairly. Someone has gotten to him." I knew he was right. I could feel it in every ruling, every contemptuous look Maxwell gave me, every smirk on Jason's lawyer's face. The system I'd trusted to protect me was being used as a weapon against me, but I didn't have the resources to fight back. Not yet. In the end, I signed the settlement. I walked away from my marriage with $15,000, no property, no alimony, and a legal agreement that I wouldn't speak publicly about Jason or our divorce. The house I'd helped pay for, the savings account I'd contributed to for 8 years, the car, the furniture, even the wedding gifts, all of it went to Jason. I was left with a suitcase of clothes, a beaten-down Honda Civic I'd bought used in college, and a crushing sense of injustice that kept me awake at night. I moved into a studio apartment in Ballard, the cheapest place I could find that wasn't completely falling apart. It was 400 square feet with water stains on the ceiling, a radiator that clanked all night, and neighbors who fought so loudly I could hear every word through the thin walls. I got a job waitressing at a diner, the only place that would hire me after I'd been blacklisted from every marketing firm in the city. Someone had made sure I couldn't work in my field again. Someone wanted me broken, isolated, and powerless. For a while, I thought about giving up entirely. I thought about leaving Seattle, starting over somewhere else, becoming someone new. But every time I considered it, I thought about my mother. About how she'd raised me to be strong, to fight for what was right, to never let people walk over me. I thought about the last conversation we'd had a week before she died, when she'd told me she was working on something important, something that could change a lot of lives. I thought about how determined she'd sounded, how alive. And I thought about that car accident, about how it had never made sense. About how my mother, who never drank more than a glass of wine with dinner, who was the most careful driver I'd ever known, had supposedly gotten drunk and driven off a cliff in a rainstorm. I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to her death than I'd been told. That's when things started to get strange. 2 months after my divorce was finalized, I received a letter. Not an email, an actual physical letter delivered to my apartment by courier. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Portland, Oregon, and a date and time. The date was 3 days away. There was no signature, no explanation, just that address and time. I almost threw it away. It screamed scam or worse, but something about it nagged at me. The address was in Lake Oswego, an affluent suburb of Portland where my mother's older sister, Eleanor Vance, had lived before she died. Aunt Eleanor had always been eccentric, distant, the kind of relative you saw once every few years at holidays and barely knew. She'd died 6 months before my mother, and I'd been too caught up in my own grief to pay much attention. Now, looking at this letter, I wondered if I should have. On the appointed day, I drove to Portland. It took 3 hours, and with every mile I questioned whether I was being an idiot. But I had nothing left to lose. Nothing except time, and I had plenty of that these days. The address led me to a storage facility on the outskirts of Lake Oswego, the kind of place with rows of identical orange doors and a keypad entry system. There was an envelope taped to the gate with my name on it. Inside was a key and a unit number. Unit 237 was at the far end of the complex. I unlocked the roll-up door and pulled it open, and my breath caught in my throat. The unit was packed floor to ceiling with boxes, filing cabinets, computer equipment, and what looked like surveillance gear. In the center of it all was a duffel bag sitting on a folding chair. Taped to the bag was another envelope with my name. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a letter in my aunt's handwriting, and the moment I started reading, everything clicked into place. "Dearest Evelyn," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've suffered enough that you're ready to hear the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I wanted to protect you for as long as possible. But the time for protection is over. The time for justice has come." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing things that sounded impossible, insane. My mother hadn't died in an accident. She'd been murdered. Murdered by people working for a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the same company where she'd been a senior research scientist. She'd discovered that Meridian was falsifying clinical trial data for a blockbuster drug, manipulating results to hide dangerous side effects. When she'd threatened to go public, they'd killed her and made it look like an accident. But that wasn't all. According to Eleanor, Jason wasn't just some random guy I'd met at a friend's party. He'd been planted in my life specifically to watch me to make sure I didn't dig too deeply into my mother's death. Natalie had been recruited later, brought in to keep me emotionally isolated and vulnerable. My job lost, my divorce, all of it had been orchestrated to keep me powerless. Eleanor wrote that she'd spent the last years of her life investigating, gathering evidence, building a case. She'd known she was dying, cancer eating away at her, and she'd worked feverishly to compile everything I'd need to fight back. "In this unit, you'll find everything," she wrote. "Documents, recordings, financial records, names, dates, everything. But you need to be smart about this, Evelyn. These people are dangerous. They've killed before, and they'll kill again if they think you're a threat. Use what I've given you carefully, and trust no one until you're absolutely certain of their loyalty." The letter ended with coordinates to a house in Lake Oswego and instructions to go there next. "I've left you more than evidence," Eleanor wrote. "I've left you the means to fight. I love you, Evelyn. Your mother loved you. Now make them pay for what they did to us." I sat in that storage unit for a long time trying to process what I'd just read. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the paranoid ravings of a dying woman. But another part, the part that had been screaming that something was wrong for years, knew it was true. I unzipped the duffel bag. Inside were bundled stacks of cash, $70,000 in $100 bills, and a plane ticket to Portland with a rental car reservation. I spent the next 2 hours loading everything from the storage unit into my car. Boxes of documents, hard drives, recording equipment, everything. Then I drove to the address Eleanor had given me. The house was in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by tall trees and high fences. It looked abandoned, but when I used the key from the duffel bag, the door opened smoothly. Inside, the house was fully furnished, but had the stale air of a place that hadn't been lived in for months. I found the basement entrance in the kitchen hidden behind a false panel that slid aside when I pressed a specific section of the wall. Stairs led down into darkness. I turned on the lights and found myself in what could only be described as a war room. The walls were covered in bulletin boards, each one documenting a different aspect of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' crimes. Timelines, organizational charts, financial flows, everything meticulously laid out and cross-referenced. But the centerpiece of the room was a large desk with 3 computer monitors and a locked drawer. I opened the drawer with another key from the duffel bag and found 2 things: a smartphone fully charged and password protected, and a USB drive. I turned on the smartphone. It opened to a video file. I pressed play. My Aunt Eleanor appeared on screen, looking frail and tired, but with fierce determination in her eyes. "Hello, Evelyn. If you're watching this, you've made it this far. Good. That means you're stronger than they thought you were. Now let me tell you the whole truth." For the next hour, Eleanor walked me through everything. She showed me documents proving that Meridian Pharmaceuticals had been conducting illegal clinical trials for over a decade, testing drugs on unsuspecting patients, falsifying data to get FDA approval, and burying evidence of fatal side effects. My mother, Catherine Rhodes, had been one of their senior researchers. When she'd discovered what they were doing, she'd started compiling evidence to take to the authorities. Meridian found out. Their CEO, a man named Richard Sterling, ordered her eliminated. But they couldn't just kill her outright. That would raise too many questions. So they orchestrated the car accident, tampering with her brakes and waiting for a rainy night. The police report had been falsified with the help of a corrupt medical examiner. Case closed. Accidental death due to drunk driving. But Richard Sterling hadn't stopped there. He'd known my mother might have shared information with family members, so he'd had me investigated. When they determined I knew nothing, they decided to keep tabs on me just in case. That's where Jason Vance came in. He'd been a mid-level sales associate at Meridian, ambitious and morally flexible. They'd offered him a promotion and a substantial bonus to get close to me, to monitor me, to report back if I showed any signs of suspicious behavior. Jason had played his role perfectly. He'd befriended me at a party I'd attended with college friends, charmed me, dated me, proposed to me, all while reporting every detail of my life back to Meridian. When Natalie had entered the picture, they'd recruited her too. Her aunt, Dr. Vivian Thorne, was a senior executive at Meridian, and Natalie had been happy to help for the right price. Between the two of them, they'd kept me completely under surveillance for 8 years, making sure I never questioned my mother's death, never looked too closely at the circumstances. Eleanor's video showed evidence of all of this. Recordings of phone conversations between Jason and Richard Sterling discussing me like I was a problem to be managed. Emails between Natalie and her aunt plotting how to keep me emotionally dependent. Bank records showing large payments from Meridian subsidiaries to both Jason and Natalie. The corruption went deeper than I could have imagined. Marcus Thorne, my former boss, was Natalie's uncle, also on Meridian's payroll. Judge Maxwell, the judge who'd presided over my divorce, had received a $200,000 payment from a shell corporation controlled by Richard Sterling just before my case came before him. They hadn't just ruined my life, they'd bought and paid for my destruction. The video ended with Eleanor looking directly into the camera. "You have everything you need to destroy them, Evelyn, but you need help. Good help. I've set up a trust fund in your name, $50 million that I accumulated over the years through investments and settlements from other cases I worked on. Use it wisely. Hire the best lawyers, the best investigators. Go to the FBI, but be smart about who you trust. Meridian has people everywhere." She paused, her eyes softening. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. She loved you more than anything. Now go make them pay for taking her from us." The screen went black. I sat there in that basement surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy so vast it should have been impossible to believe. But I believed it. Every word, every document, every recording. It all made horrible, perfect sense. My entire adult life had been a lie, manipulated and controlled by people who saw me as nothing more than a loose end to be managed. For the first time since I'd walked in on Jason and Natalie, I felt something other than despair. I felt rage. Cold, focused, utterly certain rage. They'd thought they could control me. They'd thought they could break me. They'd thought I would just fade away into obscurity, beaten and forgotten. They were wrong. I spent the next 3 days in that house going through every document, watching every recording, memorizing every name and every connection. Eleanor had been thorough, obsessively thorough. She'd built an airtight case, documented every crime, traced every payment. All I needed to do was deliver it to the right people. But I wasn't naive. Eleanor had warned me that Meridian had connections everywhere, and I'd seen enough to know she was right. I couldn't just walk into the Seattle FBI office and hand over a flash drive. I needed to be strategic. I needed allies I could trust absolutely. I needed to become someone they couldn't ignore or silence. First, I took Eleanor's advice and accessed the trust fund. $50 million. It was more money than I could wrap my head around, but Eleanor's letter had explained how she'd accumulated it. She'd been a whistleblower herself years ago, had taken down a different pharmaceutical company, and received a substantial settlement. She'd invested wisely and lived frugally, all while investigating Meridian. The money was meant for this exact purpose. I used a small portion to hire a private investigator, a woman named Sarah Chin, who came highly recommended by several legal advocacy groups. Sarah was a former NYPD detective who specialized in corporate fraud cases. When I showed her what I had, her eyes went wide. "This is bigger than you think," she said. "Meridian isn't just one bad company. They're connected to a network of corrupt officials, judges, and law enforcement. If you go after them, you need to be prepared for a war." That's exactly what I wanted. A war. With Sarah's help, I started building my team. We found Cassandra Hayes, a brilliant attorney who'd made her career destroying corporate giants. Cassie had taken on tobacco companies, opioid manufacturers, and chemical plants. She was ruthless, brilliant, and she had a personal vendetta against Meridian after they'd buried a case that had killed her brother years ago. When I offered her unlimited resources and total autonomy, she didn't hesitate. Next was Michael Chang, an investigative journalist known online as Shadow. Michael had exposed corruption at the highest levels of government and lived to tell about it. He was careful, methodical, and had a network of sources that rivaled the FBI's. When I showed him Eleanor's evidence, he saw the same thing I did. This wasn't just about one company's crimes. This was about systemic corruption, about how much damage powerful people could do when they thought they were above the law. Finally, we needed law enforcement we could trust. That's where FBI Special Agent Maria Cortez came in. Maria worked in the public corruption unit and had a reputation for being incorruptible. She'd turned down bribes, resisted political pressure, and had personally put 3 corrupt judges behind bars. When we approached her through a secure channel, she agreed to meet. The meeting took place in a safe house in Portland. Maria listened to everything, reviewed the documents, watched the recordings. When it was done, she looked at me with something like respect. This is the kind of case that makes careers or destroys them, but it's also the kind of case that needs to be prosecuted. I'm in, but we do this by the book. Every piece of evidence needs to be authenticated, every witness interviewed properly, every legal procedure followed to the letter. These people will have the best lawyers money can buy. We need to be perfect. Perfect. That's what we would be. We spent 6 months building the case. Cassie's legal team authenticated every document, verified every recording, traced every financial transaction. Sarah's investigators found more victims, dozens of families whose loved ones had died or been permanently injured by Meridian's drugs. Michael began publishing carefully timed articles exposing different aspects of the scandal without revealing the full scope of what we knew. Each article ratcheted up the pressure, made Meridian's lawyers and PR people scramble. But we weren't content to just build a legal case. I wanted them to suffer the way I'd suffered. I wanted them to feel powerless, isolated, afraid. So we started playing psychological warfare. Maria's FBI team froze some of Meridian's overseas accounts just enough to make Richard Sterling nervous. Cassie filed preliminary lawsuits on behalf of some of the victims, forcing Meridian to spend millions on legal fees without knowing the full storm that was coming. Michael's articles created public pressure, making investors nervous, tanking Meridian's stock price. And through it all, I had Cassie's investigators follow Jason, Natalie Marcus, Judge Maxwell. Everyone. Not to harm them, but to document everything. Their affairs, their financial crimes, their continued corrupt dealings. We built cases against each of them individually, making sure that when the hammer dropped, no one would escape. During those months, I also made sure to take care of myself in ways I never had before. I hired a personal trainer, got myself in the best shape of my life. I worked with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, processing years of manipulation and abuse. I took classes in public speaking, learned how to command a room, how to look powerful and confident even when I felt scared. I was transforming myself from a victim into a weapon. The only person who made me nervous during all of this was Ben Carter, the security specialist Cassie had hired to protect me. Ben was a former Navy SEAL who'd started his own private security firm after retiring from the military. He was competent professional and had seen enough combat to make Meridian's thugs think twice about coming after me. But he was also kind, which I hadn't expected. He checked on me, made sure I was eating, reminded me to sleep. After months of being surrounded by people who wanted to hurt me, his genuine concern was disarming. One night, after a particularly grueling session reviewing evidence, Ben found me in Eleanor's old study crying. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming rage and exhaustion. He didn't try to comfort me with empty platitudes. He just sat down next to me and said, "You're going to win this. Not because you have money or lawyers or evidence, though all that helps. You're going to win because you refuse to quit. I've seen a lot of strong people in my life, but you're something else." That moment mattered more than he probably knew. It reminded me I wasn't alone anymore. I had a team. I had resources. I had a purpose, and I had the truth on my side. The breakthrough came 8 months after I'd found Eleanor's storage unit. One of Sarah's investigators managed to flip a former Meridian security officer, a man named Derek Mills. Derek had been fired when he'd questioned some of the company's more illegal activities, and he was bitter and broke. When we offered him immunity and a generous payment, he gave us something priceless: access to Meridian's internal security system and a complete list of everyone on their payroll, both official and unofficial. That list was devastating. It included not just Jason Natalie Marcus and Judge Maxwell, but 3 other judges, 5 police officers, 2 prosecutors, and a dozen journalists who'd been paid to spike stories or write positive coverage. Meridian had created a comprehensive network of corruption, and Derek's testimony could prove it. With Derek's cooperation, Maria Cortez was able to get authorization for the full investigation. Federal warrants were issued. Assets were frozen. Wiretaps were activated. The net was closing, and the people who'd destroyed my life had no idea what was coming. I wanted to warn them, not because I felt merciful, but because I wanted them to feel that same rising panic I'd felt. So I had Michael publish one more article, this one specifically naming Richard Sterling and suggesting that federal investigators were interested in Meridian's business practices. Then I did something that felt incredibly satisfying. I called Jason. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice wary. "Evelyn, what do you want?" "I wanted you to know something, Jason," I said, keeping my voice calm and cold. "Everything you did to me, every lie you told, every time you reported back to Richard Sterling about what I was doing, all of it is going to come out. You're going to go to prison. You, Natalie, your boss, all of you, and I'm going to be there watching when they drag you away in handcuffs." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You've lost your mind. You have nothing. You're nobody. What are you going to do, sue me with your waitress salary?" "I guess you'll find out soon enough," I said, and hung up. The next call was to Natalie. She picked up immediately, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Evelyn, what a surprise. How have you been?" "Cut the act, Natalie," I said. "I know everything. About you, about your Aunt Vivian, about the money Meridian paid you to spy on me. I know about the recordings where you laugh about how pathetic I am. I know all of it." There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its sweetness. "You don't know anything. You're just a bitter ex-wife making wild accusations." "Am I? Then why did your voice just change? Why do you sound scared?" "Natalie, maybe because you know I'm telling the truth. Maybe because you know what's coming." "You have no proof of anything," she said, but her voice wavered. "I have everything," I replied. "Aunt Eleanor left me everything. Every recording, every document, every piece of evidence. She spent years building a case against Meridian, and you and Jason are right in the middle of it. So enjoy the next few weeks, Natalie. They're the last you'll spend as a free woman." I hung up before she could respond. Let her panic. Let her call her aunt. Let them all scramble to cover their tracks. It wouldn't matter. We had them. The arrests came 3 weeks later. Maria coordinated with FBI offices across multiple states. At exactly 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning, federal agents simultaneously raided Meridian's headquarters, Richard Sterling's mansion, Judge Maxwell's home, and the residences of Jason Vance, Natalie Thorne, and Marcus Thorne. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Maria had arranged for me to watch from a distance. I sat in an unmarked FBI van parked down the street from the house I used to share with Jason. Through the tinted windows, I watched federal agents in tactical gear swarm the property. They knocked, announced themselves, and when Jason didn't answer fast enough, they breached the door. 60 seconds later, they brought him out in handcuffs wearing only pajama pants, his face a mask of shock and terror. Our eyes met across the distance. He saw me sitting in that van, and he knew. He knew I'd won. He knew I'd kept my promise. The look of helpless rage on his face was the sweetest thing I'd seen in years. Natalie was arrested at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle where she'd been meeting with what we'd later learn was her new target, some poor, unsuspecting finance guy she'd been grooming. The FBI agents walked in calmly, showed their badges, and cuffed her right there in front of everyone. According to the agents, she'd tried to play innocent, crying and claiming she didn't know what they were talking about. They'd just showed her a picture of herself on their evidence board and told her to save it for trial. Judge Maxwell tried to run. He'd gotten wind that something was happening and had rushed to the airport with a one-way ticket to Argentina. He was arrested at the gate just minutes before boarding. The video of him being led away in handcuffs at the airport made national news. A sitting judge arrested for corruption. The scandal was massive. Marcus Thorne collapsed when the FBI showed up at his office. Literally collapsed. He was so convinced he'd gotten away with it that when agents informed him he was under arrest for conspiracy fraud and obstruction of justice, he had what appeared to be a panic attack. They had to call an ambulance and he was arrested from his hospital bed 3 hours later. But the biggest arrest was Richard Sterling. The FBI waited until he was at Meridian's headquarters, surrounded by his lawyers and PR team. They served the warrant in front of his entire executive board, outlining charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, racketeering, and bribery. When they led him out of the building in handcuffs past all the employees who'd believed in Meridian's mission, past the cameras that had gathered after Michael's articles, past protesters who'd lost family members to Meridian's drugs, he looked like a man watching his entire empire crumble in real time. I was there for that one. Maria had arranged it. I stood behind the police barricade with my team, Cassie on one side and Ben on the other, and watched Richard Sterling be shoved into a federal vehicle. As they loaded him in, he looked up. His eyes found mine in the crowd. I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, satisfied one. A smile that said, I won. The trial took 9 months to get to court. During that time, Cassie's team filed civil suits on behalf of hundreds of victims. The evidence Eleanor had compiled, combined with Derek Mills' testimony and the FBI's investigation, created an overwhelming case. Meridian's lawyers tried every trick in the book. They filed motions to suppress evidence. They attacked witness credibility. They tried to get charges dismissed on technicalities. Nothing worked. The case was airtight. One by one, the lesser conspirators started flipping. Dr. Vivian Thorne, Natalie's aunt, agreed to testify against Richard Sterling in exchange for a reduced sentence. She revealed even more horrifying details about the clinical trials, about patients who died, about data that had been destroyed, about the complete moral bankruptcy of Meridian's operations. Her testimony was devastating. Marcus Thorne also cooperated, confirming that he'd been paid to fire me and blacklist me from the industry. He admitted he'd never had any legitimate complaints about my work. He'd just done what Meridian told him to do because they'd threatened to expose his own financial crimes if he didn't comply. Even Judge Maxwell, facing the harshest charges, tried to cut a deal. He provided evidence of other judges and officials who were on Meridian's payroll, expanding the investigation even further. But Maria refused to give him significant leniency. He'd betrayed his oath as a judge, had corrupted the legal system itself. That deserved the harshest punishment possible. Jason and Natalie never flipped. Jason maintained he'd done nothing wrong, that he genuinely loved me, and our relationship had just deteriorated naturally. Even when presented with recordings of him discussing the assignment of monitoring me, he stuck to his story. Natalie was smarter. She didn't try to deny the evidence. She just refused to cooperate, hiring an aggressive defense attorney who painted her as a victim herself, manipulated by her powerful aunt. The jury didn't buy it. Richard Sterling never showed remorse. Throughout the trial, he sat with his arms crossed, sneering at witnesses, dismissing the evidence as fabricated. He seemed genuinely convinced that his money and power would save him, that he'd walk away from this, the way he'd walked away from everything else in his life. When the jury foreman read the guilty verdict on all counts, Sterling's face went white. For the first time, he understood that he'd lost. The sentencing hearing was the most satisfying day of my life. I'd been preparing a victim impact statement for months, working with my therapist to find the right words. When Judge Patricia Hendricks called me to the stand, I walked up with my head high, dressed in a navy blue suit that made me look powerful and professional. I looked at each defendant as I spoke. Your Honor, I began, these people stole 8 years of my life. They murdered my mother and made it look like an accident. They invaded my privacy, manipulated my emotions, destroyed my career, and took everything I owned. They did it for money, for power, because they could. They thought I was weak. They thought I would break. They thought I would disappear. I paused, letting my words sink in. They were wrong. I didn't break. I didn't disappear. Instead, I became their worst nightmare. I became someone who refused to let them get away with it. And now, thanks to the incredible work of the FBI, the prosecutors, and my legal team, they're going to spend the best years of their lives in federal prison thinking about the mistakes they made. I turned to look directly at Richard Sterling. You thought you were untouchable. You thought your money and power meant you could do anything without consequences. You were wrong. You're not powerful. You're not special. You're just a criminal and you're going to die in prison. Then I looked at Jason and Natalie. You thought you could fool me forever. You thought I was too naive, too trusting, too weak to see through your lies. Maybe I was for a while, but I learned, and I used everything you taught me about deception and manipulation to build the case that destroyed you. So thank you in a way. Thank you for showing me that I'm stronger than you ever imagined. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Hendricks nodded approvingly. Thank you, Ms. Rhodes. Your strength and determination are commendable. The sentences came down one by one. Richard Sterling, life in prison without possibility of parole. Jason Vance, 25 years. Natalie Thorne, 15 years. Judge Maxwell, 20 years. Marcus Thorne, 10 years. Dr. Vivian Thorne, 8 years, despite her cooperation. And a dozen other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. As each sentence was announced, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't joy exactly. It was closure. It was justice. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But the legal victory was only part of it. The civil suits that Cassie had filed resulted in the largest pharmaceutical settlement in history. Meridian Pharmaceuticals was forced to pay $5 billion to victims and their families. The company itself was dissolved, its assets liquidated, its patents seized. Richard Sterling's personal fortune, estimated at over $2 billion, was frozen and would be distributed among the victims. Jason, Natalie, and the others had their assets seized as well. Every penny they'd earned from their betrayal was taken from them. I took my share of the settlement, combined it with Eleanor's trust fund, and created the Eleanor Vance Foundation. The foundation's mission was threefold: to investigate pharmaceutical fraud, to protect whistleblowers who exposed corporate corruption, and to support families affected by medical crimes. I hired the best investigators, lawyers, and researchers money could buy. Within 2 years, the Eleanor Vance Foundation had exposed 3 more pharmaceutical companies engaged in illegal practices and had supported over 50 whistleblowers in coming forward. I became a public figure, speaking at conferences about corporate accountability, giving interviews about my experience writing a book that became a bestseller. Not because I wanted fame, but because I wanted to make sure this could never happen to anyone else. I wanted other victims to know they could fight back. I wanted corporations to know they weren't untouchable. I wanted to change the system that had allowed people like Richard Sterling to operate with impunity for so long. Throughout all of this, my team stayed with me. Cassie Hayes became the foundation's chief legal officer, using her talents to go after the next generation of corporate criminals. Maria Cortez left the FBI after the case and joined us as director of investigations, bringing her connections and expertise. Michael Chang continued his journalism, but now, with the foundation's support, exposing corruption wherever he found it. Sarah Chin led our investigation division, training a new generation of private investigators to take on these cases. And Ben Carter, the security specialist who'd protected me through the darkest days, became something more. He stayed as head of security, but somewhere along the way, our professional relationship evolved into a personal one. He was the first person since my mother who I felt I could truly trust. Someone who saw me at my weakest and my strongest and respected me either way. We didn't rush anything. We took our time building something real and healthy, so different from the lies Jason had fed me. 3 years after the trial ended, I stood on a stage at the Seattle Convention Center addressing an audience of 5,000 people gathered for the Foundation's annual conference. The theme was, "From Victim to Victor, Reclaiming Your Power." As I looked out at the crowd, I saw faces like mine. People who'd been hurt, betrayed, destroyed by systems, and people who thought they were above the law. People who'd decided to fight back. "They tell you that revenge is wrong," I said into the microphone, "that you should forgive and move on, that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And maybe that's true for some people. But for me, my anger wasn't poison. It was fuel. It was the thing that kept me going when I had nothing left. It was the thing that transformed me from a victim into someone who could fight back." The crowd erupted in applause. I waited for them to quiet down before continuing. "I'm not going to tell you to forgive the people who hurt you. I'm not going to tell you to let go of your anger. What I will tell you is this: use it, channel it, Turn it into action, whether that's legal action, advocacy, exposing the truth, or simply rebuilding your life in a way that proves they didn't break you. Use your pain as motivation to become stronger. I paused, thinking about everything I'd been through, everyone I'd lost, every betrayal I'd survived. My mother died fighting for the truth. My aunt died building the case that would bring her killers to justice. I nearly died too, not physically but spiritually. They almost succeeded in breaking me, but they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They thought I was naive because I trusted. They thought I was predictable because I followed the rules. I smiled, and it was genuine, fierce, victorious. They learned differently, and now they're spending the rest of their lives in prison while I'm standing here successful, happy, and free. So my advice to all of you is simple. Don't let them break you. Don't let them convince you that you're powerless. You're not. You're so much stronger than you know. And when you harness that strength, when you stop being a victim and start being a fighter, there's nothing you can't accomplish. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. As I left the stage, I caught my reflection in a monitor screen. The woman looking back at me was unrecognizable from the scared, broken person who'd walked in on her husband's betrayal 3 years ago. This woman was confident, powerful, successful. This woman had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into a force for good. This woman had won. Later that night, I visited the cemetery where my mother and Aunt Eleanor were buried. I'd bought them plots side by side in a beautiful spot overlooking Lake Washington. I sat between their graves, watching the sunset paint the water gold and orange. "We did it," I said quietly. "Everything you worked for, everything you sacrificed, it mattered. Richard Sterling is in prison. Jason and Natalie are in prison. Meridian is gone. And the foundation is saving lives, protecting people, making sure what happened to us doesn't happen to others." I stood up, brushing dirt from my pants. "I know you can't hear me, but if you can, I want you to know something. You taught me that truth matters, that justice matters, that fighting for what's right, even when it costs you everything, is worth it. I'm living proof of that now. So thank you for loving me, for protecting me, for giving me the tools to fight back. I promise I'll keep fighting. For as long as I live, I'll make sure your deaths meant something." As I walked back to my car, I pulled out my phone. Ben had texted asking how the speech went. I smiled and typed back that it went well, that I'd tell him all about it over dinner. Normal things. Happy things. The kind of things I never thought I'd have again. My life isn't perfect. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still feel the scars of what was done to me. But I've learned that scars are evidence of wounds that healed, proof that you survived something that should have killed you. My scars are mine, and I wear them with pride now. So that's my story. That's how a broken woman with nothing became someone powerful enough to bring down an empire. That's how I turned betrayal into justice, pain into purpose, and victimhood into victory. They thought they could destroy me. Instead, I destroyed them. And you know what the best part is? Every single day, they wake up in prison cells and they know I put them there. They know they underestimated me. They know they lost. And they'll spend the rest of their lives knowing it. That's not revenge. That's justice. And it tastes sweeter than I ever imagined. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, if you lost everything and discovered the conspiracy against you, what would you have done? Would you have run? Would you have fought? Would you have given up? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story inspired you, if it gave you hope that you can overcome whatever you're facing, then hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of people who refused to be victims. Because the world needs to hear these stories. The world needs to know that the powerful don't always win. Sometimes, just sometimes, justice prevails.